Welcome to Incredible Idaho. I'm Jack Hemingway. Tonight's show begins with a trip on Idaho's fish taxi. All through our high mountain country, beautiful alpine lakes sparkle like glistening diamonds scattered among the granite peaks. To quietly fish one of these gems is a remarkable experience, not soon forgotten. A study in solitude for Idaho anglers. But you know, until 1920, many of these lakes were totally barren, totally bereft of fish. 10,000 years ago, the powerful glaciers of the Ice Age groaned and scraped, shifting, building, and tearing down until finally, spent, they retreated. Left behind was a sculptured terrain of craggy peaks and magnificent cirques, shielding at least 2,000 mountain lakes in Idaho's backcountry. But these same sheltering mountains became barriers, draining the lakes by sheer vertical streams and waterfalls, creating an impossible route for even the hardiest native fish to access. The mountain lakes were destined to remain empty. But in the 1920s, the Idaho Department of Fish and Game and the U.S. Forest Service began a fish taxi. Mule trains loaded with 10-gallon milk cans transported tiny trout fry into these alpine lakes. And with a few changes, this same fish taxi service continues today.
Whoop. Went up. Whoop.
For Fish and Game Manager Stacy Gebhardt, there's no better mode of transportation than a reliable mule.
Come on, Skeeter.
Skeeter follows in the footsteps of 70 years of mule trains, transporting fish over steep, rocky trails through spectacular country.
Now, one thing about mules, they're a lot more sure-footed than some horses I've used. I feel a lot better on a mule than a horse.
Tucked in Skeeter's saddlebags are 1,000 trout, measuring less than 2 inches long. Their destination is Hidden Lake, about 3 miles up the trail.
This is probably the best duty you can get in Fish and Game is packing fish, for me anyway. Depending on the size, I've carried up to 3,000 to 4,000 fish if they're really tiny. And normally, we've got enough fish in one bag to stock one lake. We can haul 6 bags to a mule and stock 6 lakes on one trip if we have a group of lakes that are together and that need planning.
The lake lives up to its name. It's tucked into a basin hidden by thick pine forest, a perfect spot to spend a summer afternoon fishing for trout.
Well, looks like they enjoyed their ride, the mule. Need to set them in the lake now, let them acclimate to the lake temperature for about 20 minutes.
These little guys are West Slope cutthroat trout, a native of Idaho.
Mix a little lake water with it here. Ease them into it, their new home.
2 summers from now, they'll be large enough to catch. In 3 or 4 summers, they'll be big beauties. But the cutthroat won't reproduce because Hidden Lake, like most of these mountain lakes, has no inlet and trout need moving stream water to spawn. For this to remain an angler's paradise, old Skeeter the mule must return every 2 years carrying his precious cargo. The journey actually begins here, in the raceways of the McCall Hatchery. In the early 60s, Stacy Gebhardt began experimenting with new methods of transporting trout. He replaced the cumbersome 10-gallon milk cans with plastic bags. This cut the weight from 110 pounds to 6 and upped the survival rate to 100%. A pound of fish, that's about 1,000 tiny trout, are loaded with 3 quarts of water into a plastic bag that's inflated with pure oxygen. Some will journey gently by the old-fashioned mule train, but most will arrive in their new homes with a bit more of a splash. Stocking fish from the air isn't new either, but the efficiency has increased dramatically with the advent of lighter plastic bags and modern aircraft.
You just turn on end and go straight into the lake, and sitting in the back seat, you're basically hanging by the seat belt. he pulls up out of it and you pull the plug of the fish, it just kind of sucks you down the seat and fly up over the next ridge, and your stomach kind of comes on up to your everything else. It feels great. Best ride I've ever had. Better than a roller coaster.
The fish, too, get quite a ride, followed by a 500-foot drop into a mountain lake. But it appears to be working. Hatchery Superintendent Rob Hill testifies to the quality fishing experience to be found in Idaho's Alpine lakes.
Yeah, I've gotten up to quite a few in the McCall vicinity, and it's probably the best fishing available. You don't run into very many other people, and you get a good walk out of the deal and some real good scenery.
Cute little guys.
Melanie and Paul Spieler are spending their second wedding anniversary doing just that, walking and enjoying the scenery. But it's not camping gear they're packing on their backs.
Each year at this time, we recruit volunteers from our volunteer base who like to backpack these fish into the various lakes where they're not accessible by car or it's not feasible to stock them by air.
This is a beautiful lake.
20 to 25 lakes are stocked each year by volunteers like Paul and Melanie.
They are on the wrong end. There we go.
Planting fish is just one undertaking of the volunteer program at Fish and Game. The projects vary, but the motivation remains the same: the conservation of Idaho's outdoors and wildlife.
When Bob told us we're coming in to plant fish and then come back on the same trip and pick up the garbage, that made it more appealing than it was in the first place. My wife and I just love Idaho, and it is a crying shame to see people leave the state a mess. It's really disappointing.
I really like doing things to help ensure that everything's going to stay wild and that the environment's going to be okay, and that people can come up and do fishing in places like this and enjoy their stays in the outdoors. And we're hoping to come back in 2 years on our 4th anniversary and come catch some of the fish we just released.